1940s have been a decade of breakthroughs and developments in medicine and psychiatry. Scientists have developed a new technology to cure mentally ill adults. With the use of electroshocks, the minds of sick patients are being wiped clean, giving them a fresh start. On this blank slate, physicians then imprint a new, healthy personality.
Remaking people, shocking them into obedience. This is a story about that powerful idea. In the 1950s, it caught the attention of the CIA. The agency funded a series of experiments. Out of them was produced a secret handbook on how to break down prisoners. The key was using shock to reduce adults to a childlike state.
It's a fundamental hypothesis of this handbook that these techniques are in essence methods of inducing regression of the personality. There is an interval, which may be extremely brief, of suspended animation, a kind of psychological shock or paralysis. Experienced interrogators recognize this effect when it appears, and know that at this moment the source is far more open to suggestion, far likelier to comply than he was just before he experienced the shock.
But these techniques don't only work on individuals. They can work on whole societies. A collective trauma, a war, a coup, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack puts us all into a state of shock. And in the aftermath, like the prisoner in the interrogation chamber, we too become childlike, more inclined to follow leaders who claim to protect us. One person who understood this phenomenon early on was the most famous economist of our era, Milton Friedman. Friedman believed in a radical vision of society in which profit and the market drive every aspect of life, from schools to healthcare, even the army. He called for abolishing all trade protections, deregulating all prices, and eviscerating government services. These ideas have always been tremendously unpopular, and understandably so. They cause waves of unemployment, send prices soaring, and make life more precarious for millions. Unable to advance their agenda democratically, Friedman and his disciples were drawn to the power of shock.
The subject should be rudely awakened and immediately blindfolded and handcuffed. When arrested at this time, most subjects experience intense feelings of shock, insecurity, and psychological stress. The idea is to prevent the subject from relaxing and recovering from shock.
Friedman understood that just as prisoners are softened up for interrogation by the shock of their capture, massive disasters could serve to soften us up for his radical free market crusade. He advised politicians that immediately after a crisis, they should push through all the painful policies at once before people could regain their footing. He called this method economic shock treatment. I call it the Shock Doctrine. Take a second look at the iconic events of our era, and behind many, you will find its logic at work. This is the secret history of the free market. It wasn't born in freedom and democracy. It was born in shock.
Isolation, both physical and psychological, must be maintained from the moment of apprehension. The capacity for resistance is diminished by disorientation. Prisoners should maintain silence at all times. They should never be allowed to speak to each other.
There's one other thing I've learned from my study of states of shock. Shock wears off. It is by definition a temporary state. And the best way to stay oriented, to resist shock, is to know what is happening to you and why.
I left North America after September 11th, partly because of seeing our movement so fearful and so uncertain. And I suppose I ran away. I went to Argentina and lived there over a couple of years, 2002, 2003. Argentina in these years was a little bit of a magnet for exiles of the anti-corporate movement who didn't feel at home anymore in their homes. And I was part of this move, and we made a film called The Take about a group of workers in Argentina who occupied their factories that had been closed down and turned them into workers' cooperatives. And on one night we were filming a scene for The Take, and it was in this factory in Patagonia, in Neuquén, southern Argentina. Beautiful, beautiful landscape, really flat desert, and this was a tile factory. It's actually the largest tile factory in Latin America. They make bathroom tiles, kitchen tiles, because there's a lot of sand around, and they process it into tiles. And this factory had gone bankrupt. People were told that they were going to lose their jobs, like so many other people in Argentina. At that point, 60% of the country had been pushed below the poverty line. They unfired themselves. They said, no, we refuse to be fired. And they moved back into their factory, and they insisted on working. It was like an anti-strike, right? Strikers withhold their labor. They insisted on providing it, turned the factory into a sustainable democratic business. But they were constantly facing police repression, constant attempts to take back the factory so that they could sell off the machines, just continue the sort of vulturization, because there were still some valuable parts. The owners didn't want to put it to work. They just wanted to sort of milk every last dollar of it. So every worker in this factory was given a slingshot. And they were armed with these little balls that were part of actually the process of making these tiles. There were these little ceramic balls. And to make to grind the sand and turn it into the material for the tiles, they would be put in these massive machines with these tiny little ceramic balls. So they had a lot of these balls around, and everybody had like a little pouch and a little slingshot. So for our documentary, we wanted to shoot a group of the workers on the roof of this factory, looking out on the Patagonian desert, shooting their slingshots at sunset, magic hour. And so we went up on the roof, and we shot these scenes. And I remember it so well because that was the night that the shock and awe bombing of Baghdad began. And it was such a strange feeling to be on that roof with our slingshots, with our medieval weapons, and looking out onto this flat horizon and imagining it stretching all the way to Baghdad, where the lights of shock and awe with so immeasurably more powerful weaponry was descending on that city. It was strange to watch the war from Argentina, but I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that because I think that if I hadn't been living in Argentina at that moment, I never could have written the Shock Doctrine. That's for two reasons. The first was that after the shock and awe, after that first shock, we immediately saw a second shock. And I remember reading about this in Argentina, Paul Bremer's arrival, business suit, combat boots, remember? The uniform of the new economy. And this descent of these companies like Halliburton and Bechtel, you know, being in Latin America and hearing that Bechtel had just arrived in Iraq to rebuild the water system, I mean, this means one thing. In Argentina, Bechtel is the company that privatized the water, just as it was the company that privatized the water in Bolivia. It was so controversial, it was thrown out of the country. So I wrote at the time, this is not reconstruction, it's robbery. It's robbery disguised as reconstruction. It's privatization in disguise. But it felt like there was something very new going on, because in Argentina, this economic model had just been overthrown in a massive popular uprising. You know, that's why we were there. That's why we were documenting this extraordinary phenomenon. That in December 2001, while we in North America were quite paralyzed with fear, in Argentina there was an economic meltdown, looting. People were locked out of their banks. There were scenes actually quite similar recently in the UK when a large bank closed its doors. But in Argentina it went wild, and people, you know, lost their life savings. They attacked the banks, and then they overthrew the government. They overthrew 5 presidents in 2 weeks. And what was so incredible, what was so incredible about this moment was that, you know, what we in the movement against corporate domination had felt in these fleeting moments at summits when we had unmasked the system and we had held it to account outside of these meetings where the agenda was being advanced. You know, in Argentina, this happened, but it was at a national level. It wasn't just a group of activists, right? It wasn't just union leaders and environmentalists and students. It was everyone. It was millions of people. And they were going after what they called el modelo, the model. The model being the Washington Consensus, the policies that I've been discussing. And that's why the cry in the streets was que se vayan todos, all of them must go, right? It was a revolt against the entire political class and its integration with the business elites and these international institutions that have been enforcing these policies. And then suddenly everybody looked at each other and went, what are we going to do now? We don't have any more politicians to throw out. And so they started organizing at the neighborhood level. But there did feel to us like there was a connection between the fact that Latin America, not just Argentina, but so much of the continent in that moment was in revolt against El Modelo. And that here was Paul Bremer arriving in Baghdad. By his admission, the city is still on fire. And he announces it's open for business. And he announces that Iraq is going to be a free trade zone, the freest trade zone in the world, absolutely no restrictions. He proceeds to write an entire new economic architecture for the country. He writes 100 new laws, allows foreign banks to come and go as they please, allows foreign companies to own 100% of Iraqi assets, to take 100% of their profits out. The contracts will last up to 40 years. He announces that Iraq's 200 state-owned companies will be sold off. I mean, people say this is a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. You can go online and read all of these edicts. The man left a paper trail. So it seemed to me that here we were, in Latin America, which had been the laboratory for so many of precisely these policies, and it was no longer possible to enforce these policies with any veneer of consent, right? But remember, just before September 11th was the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City, where there were such grand plans to make a free trade zone that would start in Alaska and go all the way down to Chile. You don't hear very much about that anymore. You know, we're told so often that our movements are ineffective, that they fail. There isn't a world leader in Latin America that would ever, at this point, come out in favor of the free trade area of the Americas. But in 2001, in April 2001, 34 heads of state went to Quebec City, and every single one of them signed on the dotted line and said, we will create this free trade zone. So that is the power of social movements, to put pressure on their politicians, because, you know, it's an absolute no-go zone. You just can't go there. So here was Latin America in revolt against this consensus that never was. And here these same policies were being imposed now with brute violence. Bomb before you buy is what I wrote at the time. Don't ask. Take on the battlefields of preemptive war. Economic shock therapy through shock and awe. This is what I mean by disaster capitalism. So it felt there seemed to be a connection to me that we were entering a violent new phase. Precisely because there was so much opposition to these policies, that it was no longer going to advance in these polite summits in places like Seattle or Geneva or in Washington. It was going to ride on the backs of disasters. There would be no asking. There would just be taking now. I went to Iraq in that first year. When I got back from Argentina, I decided that I had to go there. And it actually had something to do with something else I learned in Argentina. I said that I don't think I could have written this book had I not lived there, had I not seen the war through the eyes of my Latin American friends. There was another element, and that other element was something I heard very often in this period in Argentina, which was, they did this to us. And at the time I didn't understand what that meant, because as far as I knew, Argentina had never been invaded by the United States, had never been occupied. So the analogy seemed to me to be false. I knew that there had been a military dictatorship in Argentina, but it didn't seem to me that similar to what we were seeing in Iraq. But the more I learned about Argentina's history and the more I learned about the history of the southern cone of Latin America, the more I did start to see very stark similarities in what I'm calling here the Shock Doctrine. Because in that period, you had a series of very shocking events, of violent overthrows of regimes, particularly in Chile, which was a tremendous shock to that country because there had been 41 years of uninterrupted democratic rule. And that shock was immediately followed by what Milton Friedman called at the time economic shock treatment, which was this rapid fire, extreme country makeover, just doing it all at once. And what the Chicago Boys did in Chile was turn it into a laboratory for precisely the ideas that we now associate with the Bush administration: charter schools, privatization of Social Security, a 15% flat tax. 15% flat tax was brought to Iraq by Paul Bremer in that first summer. And Michael Fleischer, who was head of private sector development, told the Iraqis, I don't know what you're complaining about because the entire Republican Party is jealous of your tax code. So, these countries, if you read Milton Friedman's manifesto, Capitalism and Freedom, all these policies are there. But they actually weren't possible to impose in the United States under democracy. But the first place where they escaped the textbook was Chile, and to a lesser extent Argentina. So you had the shock of the coups, followed by the economic shock therapy. And it was also enforced, as we know, by far less metaphorical shocks, by the shocks in the torture chambers. These were torture regimes. These were regimes that used torture systematically. And not just to get information about, where an underground leftist group might be hiding out. Torture was a means, as it always is, of mass communication. Torture is never fully private. We talk about it taking place in the shadows, but it's not effective unless some of it leaks out, unless we hear about it, unless we get the message that this is what happens to you if you transgress. And this is what's missing from our debate about torture in this country. It's all about, does it work? The 24 scenario, is the information reliable? It works. Torture works. Not necessarily in getting information out, but in its larger purpose, which is to spread fear and terror. Nothing spreads fear like torture. Nothing sends the message of obedience like you could end up in a black hole and no one will know where you are and you'll never get out and you'll lose all your rights. Many people around the world have gotten the message, have received the transmission that has been sent from Guantanamo, which is a public prison, is it not? It's not hidden away. It's fluorescently lit. And the Pentagon photographs it and releases the photographs to the press periodically and brings journalists on guided tours. Guantanamo is transmitting to the world, and some people are not aware of whether that they have gotten the message too, because they don't believe themselves to be vulnerable. Many people have gotten the message. Many people have gotten the message because they know they fit the profile, because of the color of their skin, because of their religion, because of their political activity. Now, in Latin America, torture obviously played this role. We know that. And so this is what my Latin American friends were telling me, that this happened to us, that this economic model came to this part of the world through shock and terror, just as it was being brought to Iraq through shock and awe, and later the shock of the torture chamber. So a friend of mine in Argentina, Claudia Cunha, on one of my last days, she was a journalist in Buenos Aires, she said to me, blood gets in your eyes. And what she was saying to me, what she was trying to explain to me, was how hard it was during the dictatorship to see that the junta had an economic program, had goals of their own, that the violence was not just sadism and was not just about repressing the country, but that they were revolutionaries, of the right, that they had a radical program, and that this was not just a murder scene, the country where 30,000 people were disappeared. It was the site of an extraordinarily violent armed robbery, which is to say that there was a goal, that the country was being looted and it required violence to loot it. But she said, the problem was that we were so focused on the terror, we were so focused on shutting down the torture chambers, so focused on kicking out the generals, that the economic project that they put in place was never our focus, and it proved stronger than the military regime itself. So we did kick them out, and we did shut down the torture chambers, but the economic project lived on. And what she was saying was, in some ways the mind and the heart rebels against looking for a reason behind terror. And that's what she was saying about how blood gets in your eyes. Blood is blinding. Terror is blinding. And I thought of that when I went to Iraq, because I went there to cover the economic side of the war, and I was absolutely determined not to get distracted by every single bomb. And it was so hard. The first night I arrived I would have these debates with the photographer I was working with, Andrew Stern, he's a fantastic photographer, but like every photographer wants to go to the blast site, right? And we would have these big arguments about the politics of bomb chasing, because that's what everyone was doing. And you come back with the same story, war is hell. It's hideous. And so we were trying to come up with strategies, okay, well, if a bomb goes off, a block away we'll go. If it goes off 2 blocks away. We won't go. This was actually the negotiations we were having on our way to the country, because we had all these appointments with labor leaders and factories set to be privatized, and oil workers and families who were organizing against these policies. And I knew that if we allowed ourselves to just become war correspondents, that was the only story we'd tell. And within 3 hours of our arrival, the windows of our hotel were blown out by a major bomb a block away. And of course we went. And I just remember that night thinking about Claudia and thinking about what she had told me about how blood gets in your eyes. And it really kept me focused, maybe brutally focused in a way, to try to tell this story. And it became surreal when I was in Iraq, where we would be driving down a highway and there'd be a bomb would go off on the side of the road, and every car on the highway would make a U-turn to go in the opposite direction. We would be on our way to a state vegetable oil company that was supposed to be privatized, and we had an appointment with one of the workers, and our driver's going, okay, he wants to turn around, everyone's turning around, and we're going, nope, we've got to keep going, and Andy wants to stop at the bomb site, take pictures, going, nope, we're going to the vegetable factory. We're going to the vegetable oil factory. Because there is a why. There is a reason behind the violence. And I think we do need to somehow keep sight of that. When I left Iraq, the tides had turned. The 4 Blackwater employees who are actually in the news today, because Blackwater is being blamed for their deaths, the 4 Blackwater employees that were strung up on the bridge in Fallujah, that happened while I was in Iraq. And it changed everything. That was the turning point. It was the turning point because the Bush administration decided to retaliate against the entire city of Fallujah and engage in brutal collective punishment to avenge the deaths of these 4 mercenary soldiers. And it was the extraordinary brutality of that episode of the siege in Fallujah that decisively turned the country against the U.S. And it's never, the country has been descending into increasingly complex violence ever since. I don't really use the word civil war, because I don't think that that's exactly accurate. When we left Iraq, I concluded that this experiment had failed, that this experiment in trying to create a model free market economy in the heart of the Arab world, which was the stated goal, that it had been a failure. Shock therapy through shock and awe had backfired. And the theory, Richard Armitage, the former Deputy Secretary of State, he came out a couple years ago and explained what the theory was. He said the theory was that Iraqis would be so disoriented and so overwhelmed by the bombing and by the collapse of Saddam's regime that they would be, and this is a quote, easily marshaled from point A to point B. Iraqis were not easily marshaled from point A to point B. And so I wrote a piece for Harper's. It was called Baghdad Year Zero. And the subtitle was Pillaging Iraq in Pursuit of a Neocon Utopia. And it was about this quest to blank the slate in Iraq, to start over from year zero, and to build this model state, this corporate utopia, and how it had actually, ironically, created a ghoulish corporate dystopia, where the very corporations who had been so excited about taking advantage of this amazingly profitable economic architecture that Paul Bremer had generously laid down for them, allowing them to extract such enormous profits from the country and buy off Iraq's assets at fire sale prices, they fled the country. Right? I mean, when we left, there was an evacuation going on, and it was clear, at that point, there had been a bunch of big deals announced, like GM was supposed to open, it sounds absurd even now to even think it's possible, but GM was supposed to open a factory in Iraq. HSBC was planning to open branches all over Iraq. So one by one, these companies all left, right? Because this, by trying to create the most perfect place in the world to do business, totally free of any restrictions, they had so decisively turned the country against them that going to a business meeting could get you beheaded. That was the world that they created, and that's not an exaggeration. That was happening. Contractors were getting beheaded, and the videos were circulating all over the internet. And the killing of those Blackwater security guards was a turning point for the business community, because they hire Blackwater and companies like them to protect them. So if that's what happens to the people who are supposed to protect you, you don't go to Iraq, right? I mean, the symbolism of those Blackwater guys on that bridge, their charred bodies, that was the turning point for this dream of creating this free trade zone. So that's what I concluded. They tried and they failed. I'd never seen this kind of failure before. I don't think anyone had. I have reconsidered. I don't believe that Iraq is a corporate failure. I think that Plan A failed. As I said, there's a paper trail. We know what Plan A was. But there was also a Plan B. And maybe it wasn't even fully articulated in the minds of the architects of the war. But the point is that this war was rigged so it couldn't fail. So it couldn't lose. And by failing, I'm not talking about the Iraqi people who have obviously lost, and I'm not talking about the American taxpayers who have obviously lost. I'm talking about corporate America. Because the worse things got and the worse things get in Iraq, the more privatized this war becomes. And there is an economic boom taking place in Iraq. And there is a new economy that has emerged in Iraq. It is simply not the new economy that they had originally foreseen. It is what I call in the book the disaster capitalism complex. It is a radical new version of a corporate state, a corporate military state. Now, we know what happened with Blackwater a couple of weeks ago. We don't know exactly what happened, but the Iraqi government say that unprovoked, one of the guys got jumpy, somebody didn't stop at a checkpoint, next thing you know, 20 people are dead in a square in downtown Baghdad. The Iraqi government decides to kick out Blackwater because they say this is the 7th such incident. This is the first time we've heard about it, which is itself a chilling idea. Never any charges, of course. They've been operating totally lawlessly. So the Iraqi government says enough, not because this is a particularly brave government, but because Blackwater is so hated and is such a symbol of the absolute worst of this brutal occupation that to hold on to power, Maliki felt that he needed to take this stand against Blackwater. This is a measure of the rage at these companies in Iraq. And what do we find out? That the State Department says that the diplomatic corps cannot survive in Iraq without Blackwater. It is entirely dependent on Blackwater. So even whether or not they're guilty or not is besides the point. Blackwater can't leave, right? So this raises an interesting question. And this is what I'm referring to as the economic boom that emerged as things got worse in Iraq. Because, of course, the way in which the war was rigged so that it couldn't fail, is this much maligned decision by Donald Rumsfeld to send this very pared down force and not to send more soldiers as things got worse, but to stick to his guns on his idea of this sort of lean, mean military. And there has been a corporate mission creep. So when the war began, there were 3 U.S. soldiers for every contractor, and now there are more contractors than there are U.S. soldiers. There are 180,000 contractors in Iraq, significantly more than U.S. troops. And so as the country spirals out of U.S. control, Blackwater, which originally was on contract just to protect Paul Bremer, starts engaging in combat in Najaf against the Mahdi army. And there are allegations of all kinds of shootouts that are not just defensive, but actually fighting alongside the Marines, and in some cases being in command. And we find out about this through scandal. I mean, we find out about the extraordinary role that Blackwater is playing when there is a massacre. Just like when we saw those horrifying photographs leaked out of Abu Ghraib, we found out that some of the interrogators in those photographs were not U.S. military interrogators, but were actually working for private corporations, Khaki and Titan. Why? Because as the country spiraled out of control, the war moved into the jails because they couldn't control the streets. So they brought the streets into the jails, rounding up thousands and thousands of Iraqis and just randomly interrogating them. But they didn't have enough interrogators, so they ordered them like pizzas from Khaki because they don't have to train them. And Khaki has some strange, vague contract actually not even with the U.S. military, just with another arm of the U.S. government, where they essentially play the role of temps. They're a temp agency for the U.S. government. And they, are there to provide administrative support, which can mean anything, and was stretched to mean prison interrogation. So that's what I mean by corporate mission creep. Halliburton, the green zone is referred to as an American zone or an international zone, or the site of the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. But what always struck me about the green zone is that this is science fiction. This is an entirely corporate state. Halliburton runs the roads, pest control, food, Hollywood movies, country and western night. It's like an all-inclusive luxury vacation. Or it's like a heavily armored Carnival cruise ship, right? Parked in this sea of despair. And if you can get into, through the walls, this maze of checkpoints, there are poolside drinks, and as I said, country and western night. And it's all patrolled by private security and some U.S. soldiers in the most dangerous spots. And you'll get shot if you stand too close to the wall on the outside. What Halliburton did there and is doing in the running of the green zone is really, it's an experiment in a sort of corporate city-state. Right? The green zone is massive. It's a very large part of downtown Baghdad. And it is a corporate state. Everything in it, the water, the electricity, it is run by this one corporation. This is something I think people don't understand. And one of the things I'm arguing in this book is what we're seeing in disaster zones. I mean it when I use the word laboratory. They are laboratories for what happens during a disaster becomes normalized, and these companies go home and they pitch themselves to local police. There's a suburb in a new city that has just incorporated outside Atlanta. It's called Sandy Springs. It's a wealthy suburb, or a upper middle class suburb, where the people there decided that they didn't want so much of their taxes going to poor African American neighborhoods around Atlanta. So they incorporated into their own city. So they had to build a city from scratch. Everything, zoning, security, tax collection, everything. So along comes CH2M Hill. CH2M Hill is one of the prime contractors in Iraq. It's also one of the prime contractors in New Orleans after the hurricane, setting up these FEMA-villes alongside Bechtel. It was also one of the prime contractors in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, working for the U.S. State Department. So CH2M Hill, who has practiced in Iraq, Sri Lanka, New Orleans, goes to the people of Sandy Springs, let us do it for you. We'll do it all. Everything. We'll set up your whole city. And all of the city employees will work for us. So Sandy Springs has become the country's first contract city, fully privatized city. So what is practiced in a disaster becomes normalized. And you have these sort of green zone suburbs, right, surrounded by their red zones, by their seas of despair, because the services in those African American neighborhoods will be even less funded, the public health system, the public transit system, because these gated green zone contract cities, which are now springing up all over Atlanta, all over the suburbs of Atlanta, are keeping their tax revenues for themselves and giving them to private contractors. So this happened after another shock. You know, there never was a debate. You weren't sick the day that everyone decided it would be a really good idea to get Blackwater to run the occupation, or to allow khaki to do prison interrogation. There never was a debate. The first shock was, of course, the shock of September 11th. And what the Bush administration did after that shock was, first of all, deepen it. When I came back from Iraq, I was really interested in how shock works, for obvious reasons. And I read for the first time, a declassified CIA manual called Kubark. It's online. Some of you may have read it. If you'd like to read it, it's on my website, shockdoctrine.org. Kubark was published in 1963. It is the guidebook for what the CIA calls creative interrogation. It describes methods that we see used in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib: extreme sensory deprivation, sensory overload, total disorientation, confusion between day and night, stress positions. The manual begins with this statement: everything you're about to read here is essentially a method for inducing regression. Regression. This is an important concept. That's what shock is. It is the transformation of adults to a childlike state. A childlike state when they become scared, dependent, disoriented, looking for parental figures. So it talks about how to put the prisoner into a state of shock through all of this unmaking, taking away their story, their narrative, their sense of who they are. That's what all of these sensory deprivation methods are really about. And then it says that an experienced interrogator will recognize this moment, which is where the prisoner goes into a state of suspended animation, a kind of psychological shock or paralysis, it says. And it's at that point that they start to see the interrogator as a fatherly figure. And it's at that point where they give up the information or the confessions or the renunciation of beliefs. It's in that window of opportunity. And when I read that manual, it really reminded me of September 11th. It reminded me of the mass regression that took place when we lost our story, when there was a gap that opened up between an event and our ability to understand and analyze that event, which is what a shock is. And that moment when far too many of us thought Rudy Giuliani was our long-lost daddy. And we gave things up that we shouldn't have given up in that moment, like the prisoner in the interrogation chamber who gives up things that are precious to him or her. We gave things up. We gave up civil liberties and power. We trusted our authority figures far too much. And if we think about what the Bush administration did in that moment, it's really interesting. I said that they deliberately deepened the shock, and I think that they did, because there was also this impulse, there was also this collective impulse of people to get out of shock fast, which is the natural impulse. People don't like to wallow in shock. You lose your story, so you try to get another story, right? You rapidly try to integrate this event into your collective narrative. And that's what we did. People poured out of their houses. They wanted to debate. They wanted to gather. They wanted to be with each other. They wanted information. They wanted connection. They wanted history. Do you remember how much people wanted history? That's why people were devouring Chomsky in that moment, because he was one of the few people who was putting these events in a historical context. And the Bush administration, what did they say? Well, go shopping, which is the opposite of connecting. And the other thing was that this attempt to understand these events is to be aligned with the terrorists, is to justify terrorism. This impulse, which was the impulse that would have actually gotten the population out of shock if we had been able to integrate that event into a cohesive historical narrative. That would have been difficult because it would have involved looking hard at American complicity in that narrative. That was the impulse, and that was what was cut off so brutally, right? And we were told, actually, not only should you not look at history and not try to understand these events, but you have just been reborn. You are a brand new people. Everything you thought you knew before no longer applies. It's all pre-9/11 thinking. You are a people with no past, no history. You are brand new. And on the receptive canvas of that post-9/11 thinking were inscribed a new language, a new crusade, the war on terror, the axis of evil, the war against Islamofascism, the long war. And it continues, and it continues. And I think that this war on history is not accidental. And, Rick said this book, it is, I've been talking about our recent past. I've been talking about our present, really. But this is a book of history. And what I do in the book is I begin in that Latin American experiment, the Southern Cone, the first laboratory for this radical ideology. And I show how it was born of those other two forms of shock, the shock to countries and the shock to bodies. And I follow the crusade through all of its key junctures. And I show that there were always shocks. Even though we have this official story that we've been living with, that this ideology swept the globe on the wings of freedom and democracy because people demanded their Reaganomics alongside their Big Macs. There were always shocks. There were always shocks. Margaret Thatcher couldn't have brought the first privatization frenzy to a Western democracy had it not been for the Falklands War, which killed 910 people and saved her career. She went from 25% in the polls to 59% in the polls, and she rode that victory abroad. And she said, we fought the enemy without in the Falklands, and now we must fight the enemy within. And that was the coal miners. And she unleashed the full force of the state on them. And there were people who were killed, and there were thousands who were injured, because there are real casualties. This is a war, and there are real casualties in this war. It was never peaceful. This is the great lie of our time. This ideology leapt forward in China in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre. They tried to impose economic shock therapy in the late 80s, and the Chinese people rebelled. There were huge strikes and protests, and there were demands for democracy. Why democracy? Just to be like America? That's what we were told on CNN. The students just wanted to be like America. No, they wanted democracy so that they could have accountability for the economic transition. They wanted economic democracy. They wanted deep democracy. They didn't want the elite of the Chinese Communist Party to just become the elite of this capitalist class as they have become, and as they became in Russia. So it was a demand to have a democratic transition from one model to the next, and they were crushed with tanks. And that shock, that message of raw terror, pulsed through that country, and it created the obedient workforce that has been so profitable and the engine of the global economy to this day. But shock wears off. This is another lesson. There were 87,000 strikes in China in 2005. 87,000 labor disruptions and protests in China. And Latin America is coming out of shock, as we know. And all of these ideas that were crushed by military tanks and think tanks, who I call the people who are paid to think by the makers of tanks. They never won the battle of ideas. They never won the battle of ideas. They just won a series of dirty wars. And so the ideas that weren't defeated bubble back up over time. We come out of shock. And what we see is that the countries that are most shock resistant are the ones where they have metabolized their history, where they have looked hard at their past and have integrated the ugliest parts of their history, looked at their own complicity with repression, and looked at how they lost their rights in the past, and that makes them shock resistant. So that's another thing I learned from living in Argentina. There's a third thing. I mentioned before that there was this uprising in 2001 where people poured out of their houses and overthrew the government. And when we were making this film, we asked a lot of people, how did this happen exactly? We don't really understand how these revolutionary moments take place in North America. Tell us how it worked. And everyone told us the same story. They said, well, what happened was that the country was in chaos. There was the looting, there was the storming the banks, there was chaos. People were really afraid. And the president, Fernando de la Rúa, went on television and he declared a state of siege. And he told people to be afraid. And he said, there are enemies that are roving the streets, and you have to stay in your homes. And he imposed a curfew. And he said, don't worry, we're in charge. Just stay home. And as he was talking, as he was declaring the state of siege, people started to hear sounds from the streets. And the sound was their neighbors banging pots and pans. And so they grabbed pans and they went out on the streets. And they marched together to the seat of government and banged until the president had to escape in a helicopter. And we said, well, why? Why did this speech so galvanize people? And they said, well, we weren't going to let them do it again, because this was how it had started in 1976, was that people had been afraid, and they had actually welcomed the coup. They had welcomed the coup. They had welcomed the promise of security, and they had given away their rights. And it was precisely because there had been this hard process of integrating that history that the country had become able to identify the signs. So when they saw their president promising them security in exchange for obedience, they rebelled. And that's, my hope for this book is simply that it will be a tool to make us shock resistant, to make us more shock resistant. Because when we integrate with our past, both recent and ancient, when we have narratives to hold on to, when we are not just running from crisis to crisis, bomb to bomb, when we have a story to hold on to, we're calmer, we are oriented, we can still be hurt, we can still lose, but what we don't do is we don't regress. Information and narrative is shock resistance. I urge you to arm yourself for when the next shock hits. Thank you.
Everyone I know is so apathetic. I work with all these young people. They don't vote. They don't even know what's going on. They're making, so little money, what do we do? How do we empower people, and how do we educate people to what's really going on? Voices are not being heard in this country, and it's just such a state of apathy.
Well, apathy, it's such a tricky word because it can change so quickly. And that was one of the things that was so amazing about what happened in this city in 1999, right? Because all we ever heard in the 90s was how apathetic young people were. And I remember when I was writing No Logo, which was a book about anti-corporate branding and also young people engaging in anti-corporate activism. I couldn't find an American publisher. And you know, Rick was mentioning our mutual friend, my editor at Picador, but that was the only publishing house that would take no logo, because every single publisher in the U.S. told me that they were really interested in it and that they cared about it, but that young people today are so apathetic. And I remember this one editor at Knopf in New York said to me, you know, I'm really interested in world politics, but young people in America want to read memoirs of eating disorders. Mm-hmm. And then when the Seattle protests happened, she called me. She was like, do you have any other books that you're writing? No, just simply in terms of the disillusionment around voting, I mean, I think what we suffer from more is less apathy than learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is actually, you know, it's a psychological phrase based on these weird experiments that they did on dogs, where, does people know what I'm referring to? The learned helplessness.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, if you get zapped and you try to escape and you can't escape, then you stop trying, right? Now think about the 2006 midterm elections, right? I mean, if people don't want to vote in the next presidential elections after that experience, it's not because they're apathetic. It's because they've been learning helplessness, right? So I think, you know, a lot of it also has to do with telling each other our victory stories as well. You know, I think that one of the most disempowering, you know, we sometimes think the media doesn't do a good enough job of telling us how bad things are. And I really started to think that the bigger problem is that we never hear success stories. You know, we never hear about people who did organize their, you know, Starbucks outlet, or, you know, or an indigenous group in Ecuador that successfully kicked out a mining company. You know, we'll hear about the mining companies and, you know, the despoiling of land. You know, that's the kind of story that actually does get out once in a while. But you almost never hear about the victories, because they actually challenge that. So I think that's part of it. I'll come back to that question.
I think you're right. It's not really apathy. It's the fact that people feel helpless. They feel there is nobody there who is going to act for them. And I think that you're absolutely right about the fact that you have to digest and know your history. And I think that the thing that is so hideous about our particular moment is that we're almost devoid of legislators who are willing to look at our history and to speak honestly. They're afraid to say any kind of truth.
Thank you.
I wonder if you would comment on the shock and awe of No Child Left Behind. We've gone from Why Johnny Can't Read to No Child Left Behind to the closing of schools in New Orleans to textbook companies making huge killings on everybody being on the same page at the same moment. Teachers are not creating curriculum anymore. They are actually delivering curriculum. Textbook publishers take pride in saying that their materials are teacher-proof, which is to say that teachers can't screw it up.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, the only thing I would just add to that, you know, is I really totally agree that this is the huge push. This is the education and Social Security are the next frontiers for total privatization. And, you know, I've referred to disaster zones as laboratories for what they want to do all the time and everywhere. Milton Friedman wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal 3 months after the levees broke. He said teachers and parents and students are scattered all over the United States. The city lies in ruins. This is a tragedy. It is also an opportunity to radically remake the education system. And then he proceeded to prescribe privatization of the public school system, which ended up being picked up by the charter school advocates. New Orleans is now the leading laboratory in the United States for charter schools. Half the students in New Orleans are going to charter schools. There used to be just 4 charter schools in New Orleans. Now I think there are around 50. And the public school system has been left to erode even more. They're completely skewing the results because these charter schools will perform better because they're excluding the most disadvantaged students in New Orleans because they can select the students that they want. So students who have very serious emotional and physical challenges, particularly because of the disaster there, are being excluded and are being dumped onto this public school system that is being starved out, while the charter schools are being showered with money from the right-wing think tanks and from Laura Bush's foundation. And, the reason for that is they want these results. They want to be able to point to New Orleans, and we're going to hear it even more and more to show that this works so that they can generalize it. And the one other thing I would say is, some of you may have heard me debate Alan Greenspan on Democracy Now! The other day. Unfortunately, as part of the preparation for that little encounter, I had to read Alan Greenspan's book. And the overarching message of his book, in that exchange he actually said it, where I asked him whether he keeps warning about this dangerous rise of economic populism, which I just think is fantastic. But apparently Alan Greenspan thinks, and keep this in mind about the apathy. Alan Greenspan thinks that there is the public is losing faith in trickle-down economics, and this is very dangerous. He's worried about it. And I asked him whether he might share some of the responsibility for this loss of faith in trickle-down economics, seeing as he presided over a period in the United States where, when Reagan took office, the CEOs made 43 times as much as their workers, and when Alan Greenspan left the Federal Reserve, they made, I think, 488 times as much as their workers. And I proceeded to list the ways in which his policies had fed this: free trade, outsourcing, the dot-com crash, now the subprime crash, deregulation of everything, the breaking of unions. He blamed the education system. He said that that's the reason for inequality in America. Americans are too dumb because of the bad teachers. He blamed the teachers. And he does it again and again in the book. So it's chilling, it's scary, and the next time there is the slightest window of opportunity, there's going to be a radical push, a radical attack on the education system, and we have to be ready. Okay. 1, 2. I'm going to take 2 at a time now, okay?
One more guy, right. And then the rest could be girls,
okay.
Women. Thanks for coming back to the Great Northwest again. I didn't hear you mention anything about the manifesto, the Project for New American Century. I wonder if that at all figured in helping you put together the pieces to their plan. Mm-hmm. And on a parallel, do you have any thoughts as to how similar that manifesto is to both, I don't know the exact names, but the manifestos that were similarly put forth by the Japanese Empire and the Third Reich during World War II?
Okay, I'm going to take another one. Sure.
I wonder if you could comment on how you weigh in on the motives of the players. In other words, to hear you talk, and I'm much more sympathetic to your view, so it's not a challenge, it sounds really sinister, really evil, and guided by greed, and et cetera, et cetera. So, my question is, what do you think their motives are? Do you think they are sincere but misguided, or do you think they are truly conscious of following sinister and evil motives?
What do you think? Let's take a vote. Sinister and evil? Sorry. I'm just kidding.
Well, a very well-known Northwest writer who wrote Everything I Ever Learned I Learned in Kindergarten said, "The line between good and evil is not a line that divides us from them, but a line down the middle of all of us." And so I think that we can either cater to the dark side or we can find ways to get back to the other half. But I would like to see how you weigh in on that.
Okay. Those are 2 great questions. I'm going to try not to give a speech for each, which I easily could. All right. Project for a New American Century, this is often held up, this document is often held up as sort of the smoking gun for the theory that 9/11 was an inside job because, it's signed by very many of the key players in the Bush administration, and they lay out their agenda for world domination, much of which they have achieved. But they say in the document, this agenda is not possible, absent an event like a new Pearl Harbor, right? So they're saying that they need a crisis to push forward with their agenda. But see, what I do in the book is I have many documents like that, from top level economists at the World Bank, at the IMF. John Williamson, who is the person who coined the phrase the Washington Consensus and codified exactly what it is. I have a quote from John Williamson saying that they've never been able to impose the Washington Consensus in the absence of a large-scale crisis. And he says, given the beneficial effects of crisis, should we not consider creating a pseudo-crisis to reap the beneficial effects of reform? So there's tons of documents in which you have people anticipating or wanting a crisis in order to push forward an agenda that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. You mentioned, other documents. I haven't seen the documents that you're referring to, but obviously the Third Reich practiced the Shock Doctrine and used crisis, and they aren't the only ones. I mean, in this book, I am not arguing by any means that this particular group of Chicago School economists and their, the politicians who enact their policies are the first group of people in the world to exploit crisis to advance their political goals. This is the oldest trick in the book. What their use of it shows us is how deeply anti-democratic their agenda is. It's not a coincidence that that the other people who spring to mind are fascists and dictators, including on the left, right? I mean, this urge to blank the slate and to start from year zero. I mean, I'm using this language very consciously. And when I start the book saying the left has been held accountable for the crimes required to impose the ugliest forms of its ideology. We have actually confronted this past. I think we've learned from this past. And I believe that that's why that when we look to Latin America and we see the rise of social movements like the Zapatistas and the MST, that participatory democracy is at the dead center of these movements. And they are building in the rubble of a failed system. This is a response to the disaster that is neoliberalism. But it's a response that is radically inclusive. That is, of course, using crisis as an opportunity, if you will, but not to blast people out of the way. As Milton Friedman was suggesting, like, yay, the teachers are away and the parents are away, we can remake the education system. But this is a crisis and an opportunity to build a more democratic, more equal society than we had before. And, Milton Friedman was very aware, his nemesis was Keynes, and he was very aware that the crisis of the Great Depression, that the market crash of 1929 had been a catalyst for progressives, for socialists, and for Keynesians to build the New Deal. And that's why they have this mission to exploit every crisis and make sure that the ideas are lying around the next time the crisis hits. That's a mission statement for the Heritage Foundation, for the American Enterprise Institute. This is not an organic intellectual movement that is bubbling up from below. It's a corporate-funded intellectual movement that makes sure that those ideas are ready to go when the next shock hits. Okay. So, in terms of the motives for the players, I don't want to be flip about it. But I do, I think it's very complicated. I think it's a very rare person who can pursue very damaging policies and without some kind of intellectual framework that serves as a rationale for that activity. right? I mean, people do horrifying things. Very rarely do they do them without some claim to a higher good. I mean, it's the role that Christianity played for colonialism. And it is the role that, supremacy, a vision of racial supremacy plays. I mean, it is a belief that you are actually building something purer and better that rationalizes extraordinary violence. And once again, the same for state communists. That rationalizes it. It is the belief in utopia that rationalizes mass purges and work camps, erasing of societies. Okay, so what is free market ideology? I believe it is a rationale. Okay, I don't really believe that it is that people fall in love with the idea of trickle-down economics and then go decide to be capitalists. Okay? I think that the role that trickle-down economic theory generally plays is it's like the friend you call, like after you've done something you're a little embarrassed about and they go, don't worry, you deserve it. That's Milton Friedman for the capitalist class. And I'll just give you an example because he's very much on our minds this evening. Alan Greenspan, in his autobiography, which I had absolutely no intention of plugging this evening, because I really urge you not to read it. I'm giving you the best parts, okay? In his autobiography, he talks about his own political awakening. And what's interesting is that as a student, he was a student at a time when studying economics was infused with a sense of purpose because it was after the Second World War, and there was very much a sense that Keynesianism was in vogue, and the sense was that economists, the mission was to prevent an economic crisis like the one that had happened in Germany and created the conditions for the rise of fascism. So these were very heady times for students. To think about the role of economics in building social justice and in fighting dangerous forces in society. Alan Greenspan, by his own admission, couldn't have cared less. Okay? He was not interested. He says he was not interested in big ideas. He was just good at math, and he was good at business, and he got his first jobs being an economic forecaster for some of the largest corporations in America. Not an ideas guy, not thinking about how to make the world a better place, okay? Even though lots of people around him were, okay? Then he stumbles across the works of Ayn Rand, okay? And has a political awakening, all right? And, Ayn Rand is just pulped up Adam Smith and Milton Friedman, right? I mean, it's pulp fiction of, radical capitalism, right? I mean, the climax of Atlas Shrugged, somebody writes a $sign in the sky as a benediction, right? This isn't subtle stuff. There's a chapter called The Utopia of Greed, okay? And so Ayn Rand's philosophy is that greed is the governing force, the best governing force of societies, that any attempt to do good is bad and doing bad is good. And Alan Greenspan goes, yeah. And becomes a Randroid, as they were called. But which is simply to say that the role of this ideology, I don't think we should give it too much respect, I guess, because for him, what he said is that he had always respected the efficiency of markets, but what Rand taught him was the morality of markets, i.e., she infused what he was already doing with this claim to a higher goal, a higher morality. So I think it's sinister.
Hi, Naomi.
Two more questions. Okay. This will be the last two, sir.
Okay. As an economist and a former student of the Washington Consensus...
Can you talk a tiny bit louder?
As an economist and a former student of the Washington Consensus in D.C., I have a twofold question.
Okay.
What is the international law framework for an occupying country to ensure that the economic development takes place in a correct fashion. And the argument that governments rely on corporations because they are short on resources and are not efficient when it comes to certain projects, which is why they need the help, can there be a framework under which corporations can work ethically?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, those are great. Okay.
You have written about the Ford Foundation in Chile and how it funded a lot of the Chicago school economists that changed their economy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how the Ford Foundation, as a philanthropic organization here in the United States, because it funds a lot of progressive organizations as well, if it serves a way as to contain sort of the left, for lack of a better way of putting it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Your first question about what is the international law framework for an occupying power in making, in ensuring that its economy develops. I suppose it's fairly unclear. There's only two reference points. There's the Hague Regulations and the Geneva Conventions. Those are the two pieces of international law that govern occupying powers. What they both say is that occupying powers have a responsibility to safeguard the assets of a country that they're occupying. Which is to say that, I mean, the reason why these laws exist, the heading before the section in the Hague Regulations, little subhead is "Pillage is forbidden." You think you shouldn't have to write this down, but it's a heading. Pillage is forbidden. It's my favorite part. I actually thought about calling the book "Pillage is Forbidden." Also, I thought about calling it "Freedman Fighter." The point is, the reason why what Paul Bremer was doing, I mean, he was claiming that these policies were so uncontested, and this is the specialty of neoliberal economists, is to present highly ideological, highly contested policies as technocratic and uncontested, right? So they were saying that all they were doing was developing Iraq's economy and safeguarding their assets by privatizing them and, laying off workers and doing everything, from the Washington Consensus Handbook. But there's a lot of international lawyers came to the opinion that this was illegal under the Hague Regulations, obviously because they were privatizing the assets, and in fact this was a large part of the reason why the privatization was called off, because it was in such a legal gray zone that quite a few international lawyers, and I quoted them at the time, were saying that if an Iraqi government came to power, an elected Iraqi government came to power and decided to reverse the privatizations and expropriate these assets from the foreign companies that had bought them, that they very well could have the legal right to do it because the privatizations were illegal under international law in the first place. The analogy I used at the time in terms of what the international law says about this is that it's basically a house-sitting rule. Like an occupier is a house-sitter. Like, you've got to take care of the house while you're occupying it, which means you can kind of, you can sleep in the bed and you can eat the food in the fridge, but you can't, just bulldoze the house and turn it into condos. That's not allowed. And that is essentially what the U.S. attempted to do in Iraq. You talked about the fact that obviously there has to be a private sector role of some kind in supplying the government. And we're talking about this contractor economy. There are always going to be contractors because government's not going to make everything that it uses. It needs to, buy everything from, pencil sharpeners to, sadly, guns. And there are all kinds of rules that govern government contracting. And what the Bush administration has done is really erode that set of rules, to massively expand the contractor economy. I have a stat in the book that There were 15,000 contracts handed out for security products in 2002, and in 2005 there were 115,000. Okay, so that's and I think it's something like the New York Times just reported on this, and I could be wrong, but I think it's something like 70% of the contracts that are being handed out are no bid. Right? So, I mean, the bidding is one of the ways that you try to have some accountability. But then the other framework for government contracting is that, because this is not part of the free market economy, because it's an entirely, it is a state economy, the contractor economy. It actually gives the government a great deal of control to make all kinds of demands of their contractors. So you can demand a higher level of you can demand that contractors pay better wages than normal corporations working in the private sector, because if these corporations are going to be making their business from public money, the public can make demands of those contractors, and that's why you have something like the Davis-Bacon, which says that any government contractor has to pay prevailing wages, not the minimum wage, but prevailing wages. And this was one of the first things that Bush changed after Hurricane Katrina. It was the first piece of legislation that he passed was to say that contractors working in New Orleans didn't have to pay prevailing wage, and that's why there was a huge amount of migrant workers who came to New Orleans to do that reconstruction work and were paid slave level wages, and had huge debts that they had paid to labor contractors to get there in the first place. So there's all kinds of things that can be done. They are systematically being dismantled. I mean, in Iraq, you could have said to the Halliburtons and Bechtels, I have to say I hate talking about this because the war was illegal. It failed because it was an illegal war, and Iraq is owed massive reparations. So I really don't like to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of if they had occupied them better, it would have been okay. I mean, I don't think it ever could have been okay. But that said, I mean, if you look at the state holds all the cards in a contractor economy. It has the contracts, and it can put whatever conditions it wants on the corporations that are getting these contracts, because it is not in the private sector. So in Iraq, there could have been a rule that Bechtel had to hire 100% Iraqis to do the work in Iraq, which would have made a huge difference in that country, because a large amount of the rage had to do with watching foreigners come in and take these jobs that Iraqis could have performed themselves. So there's all kinds of things that you can do that weren't done, because the theory behind it was simply that you just create the conditions for the most profits to be made, and the country will just rebuild itself on the creative cauldron of capitalism. So the question about the Ford Foundation, I do have a section in the book. I'm not going to get into it in great depth now about the role of the Ford Foundation in funding the human rights movement in Latin America. The Ford Foundation had funded the Chicago Boys. They were the major funders besides the U.S. State Department. And so there was a real irony in Latin America, because the Ford Foundation had played such a key role in training the economists who had worked with the dictatorships in imposing these brutal policies. But then the Ford Foundation also funded many of the lawyers who tried to get people out of jail. And what I argue in the book is that this created a strange specialization where the human rights movement really couldn't ask why this violence was happening, and it was very legalistic and narrow. And it's part of the reason why you had like this sort of economic strain, and then you had the human rights strain of activism in this region, and they were never allowed to intersect. And I say in the book, these contradictions are so stark that in 1976, Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for policies that were being implemented with blood and fire in Latin America, and in 1977, Amnesty International won the Nobel Prize for their crusading work in Argentina and Chile. cleaning up after Milton Friedman's policies. The question was about the question of whether foundations have a demobilizing effect on progressive movements in the United States. And I would have to say, I think that in general, the professionalization of activism and the replacing of activism with an aid framework can be very, very dangerous. And I think we really see this really clearly in disaster zones, where you have moments, I was just in New Orleans on the second anniversary of the levees breaking. I was there for this extraordinary exchange that was organized by a wonderful NGO called Action Aid International. And Action Aid International does a lot of great work critiquing the NGO, what in New Orleans they call the NGO industrial complex. They had facilitated this wonderful exchange between community organizers in Tamil Nadu, India, who had been fighting land grabs after the tsunami, an exchange between those amazing organizers who represented movements sometimes of 50,000 people, just huge movements in India, and they brought them to New Orleans to meet with community organizers in New Orleans. And a group from New Orleans had also gone to India, and so this was a really interesting exchange where they were talking about disaster capitalism and how it manifested itself in their respective countries. But the delegates from India, we were touring the lower Ninth Ward and looking at, what had happened there. And you see, there's no water, the homes have just been leveled, and the weeds are growing, and nothing's happened. And one of the organizers from India turned to me and said, if this happened in India, we'd have a revolution. And in thinking about why there wasn't more of a revolt in New Orleans, a lot of people pointed to the role of the foundations and the NGOs as a demobilizing force. This was a moment of rage and rebellion, and it should have been, because this was a theft of a city. It was an armed robbery. And the sort of and that rage, that was a radical and important and well-deserved rage, was dampened down, by this infrastructure that descended on the city and on the, the shelters around it, of just keeping everybody waiting for the potential of some sort of charity that was going to fix everything. And of course, in 99% of the cases, the charity really didn't come, and the homes weren't rebuilt. But that moment kind of drained away. And I've seen that dampening down impact. And I don't think it's really a grand conspiracy, but I do think that at high levels of government, there is an understanding that it's way better to have NGOs than it is to have social movements that are a hell of a lot harder to control. I will end on that note.